Welcome to the Equipto Crossover Assembly Instructions video. This video provides basic overview of the assembly and installation of the Equipto Crossover. This video is intended to supplement the assembly instructions, so we encourage you to have a printed copy of the assembly instructions as you watch this video. The AMZ Crossover platform typically comes on 3 pallets. The first pallet contains the gray elements, which provides the skeleton for the crossover platform. The first thing that you will do is find the proper hardware for each phase of the assembly. Please refer to your printed instructions to find the proper hardware. When you open it up, the splice plate will be inside the 8-foot beam. One easy tip, as you can see by the video, is to align the holes and use one bolt to hold the splice plate into place, while you slide the other plate into position. And now you'll begin the process of the installation of all the bolts. Upon completing the installation of all the 2-inch bolts, you will then move on to the next step of installing the 1.5-inch bolts along the top of the plate. There are 8 of them. After you complete the installation of the splice plate, you will then focus on installing the beam brackets. We recommend you to refer to the engineer drawings in the printed instructions to determine the spacing of the beam brackets. After you have installed the splice plate and the beam brackets, make sure that the beam is in complete alignment and torque down all the bolts. When tightening the bolts, you always must tighten from the nut side. And when tightening the brackets, only tighten the top 2 nuts to start with. Later in the process, you will tighten the 4 bolts and nuts. The next step is to begin assembly of the crossover post. We ask you once again to refer to the assembly instructions to find the proper hardware. The standard height for the crossover post will have 4 open holes at the bottom of the post. Despite this, when you are on site, we encourage you to double check and take an additional measurement of the post height to ensure that you have a minimum of 32 inches of clearance from the top of the conveyor belt to the bottom of the platform. Now we will begin the installation of the crossover on site. The first thing that you will do is to determine the position of the crossover on site. After you identify the location of the crossover, there are 2 ways to assemble the crossover. The first scenario is the assembly of the crossover without having the conveyor belt on site. The second scenario is when the conveyor belt is on site and the crossover must be assembled over the conveyor. After determining the location of the crossover and the way that you will assemble it, you will begin to install the internal beams. When installing the internal beams, always make sure that the perforated holes are facing up. Now we will show you the assembly of the crossover as if there's no conveyor in place yet. After the internal beams are installed, you will raise up the unit from one side, allowing the forklift to come in and lift it up. It is important that the forklift only raise up the beam slightly so that the main frame can be clamped to the forks of the forklift. The forklift will then safely raise up the beams to the predetermined height to facilitate post installation. The posts are installed by inserting 4 bolts into the front of the beam and installing 2 bolts into the side of the crossmember. After installing your posts, you will then go on to the next step of installing the tubular cross braces as specified in the engineer drawings in the instructions. We will now show you the alternative scenario of installing the crossover when there is a conveyor underneath. In this video, the pallet represents the conveyor. The first thing to do is to bolt in the forklift extension to the first beam. Once the beam is securely fastened to the forklift extension, position the beam over the area to install the posts. The next step will be to install the interim beam to 2 posts to create a U-section, which will then be installed to the beam. Once the main structural beam is in place with the 4 posts, your second structural beam will be brought over for installation. The final step of this stage in the process is to install the internal beams. You will now begin the installation of the stairs. The first thing that is to be done is to install the floor mounting angle. We encourage you to refer to the assembly instructions to find this part number. Using the forklift, the stairs are guided into place and installed into the main platform. After installing and securing both sets of risers, you will install the top tread. The next step is to install and secure the stair posts, followed by the installation of the railings. Please refer to your printed assembly instructions for part numbers and hardware. Once the stairs are fully assembled and installed, it is important to then square the posts of the mezzanine. After tightening all the hardware in the mezzanine, you will begin installation of the mezzanine grating. When the grating is fully secured to the mezzanine, you will begin mounting the railing posts. As you assemble the railing for the mezzanine, we encourage you to reference the assembly instructions for the part numbers and hardware. As you enter the final phase of assembly of your crossover, it is important to follow the instructions for torquing and proofing the bolts. Be sure to carefully follow the guidelines for the elevated platform and catwalk match marking standards. For the final step of the crossover installation, you will torque and anchor the posts into the floor. Once the crossover is fully assembled and installed, you will thoroughly examine the installation by following the checklist as provided. Thank you for taking the time to watch the Equipto Crossover Platform Assembly video. If you have any questions, please contact us.